Good evening and thank you for joining us on Election Day here in Oregon. I'm Laural Porter. Only a few minutes remain to drop off your ballots. 8 o'clock is the deadline, and then we should start getting results soon after that. This May primary is unlike any other we've ever had before. The coronavirus pandemic has impacted every aspect of the election cycle. Candidates couldn't hold rallies. They couldn't debate in person. They couldn't canvass neighborhoods. We'll find out tonight how that impacted candidates trying to knock off incumbents. None of the winners will be holding in-person election night parties as usual. Instead, it will happen online, remotely, like we've been doing for months now. The one thing that stayed the same is our voting process. While states like Wisconsin had to stand in line and risk their health during the pandemic to vote, Oregon voters enjoyed the ability to vote by mail. You'll notice we are social distancing here as well. Pat Doris and Maggie Vespa are covering the big races from their homes. Republican political consultant Rebecca Tweed, who ran Newt Bueller's gubernatorial campaign in 2018, will join us remotely tonight. So too will two political insiders on the left, Nakenge Harmon Johnson with the Urban League of Portland and former Portland City Commissioner Steve Novick, both joining us remotely. And KGW political analyst Len Bergstein is here with me in the studio at an appropriate social distance of about 25 feet away. Now, before we check in with all of them, I did want to show you something that really struck me, an example of how unprecedented this election really is. I got this super card in the mail from candidate Dan Ryan. He's running for city council position 2. And look, he's wearing a face mask. When have we ever seen something like this in an election? Dan Haggerty joins me now in the KGW newsroom. And Dan, this is an election like we have never seen before.
Absolutely. Speaking of social distancing, you're 20 feet from Len. They stuck me in the other room. You know, I see that picture of a candidate in a mask, and I do think that that mask has kind of become the symbol of this thing we're all collectively going through. It used to be that spiky virus, that image of the coronavirus, but I think it's been taken over by the mask at this point. I think it's something we're going to get used to, especially in the campaigns we're seeing run so far for this primary and again down the line in the general. I want to send it over to Len Bergstein now, a political analyst who's been talking about races for a very long time, but never one quite like this, Len.
Yeah, this is pretty exciting. I think it is, as we say, unprecedented, unusual. Both the coronavirus and the fact that there isn't a very exciting presidential race have depressed some aspects of the race or changed them pretty dramatically. We'll talk about that the evening. What's really fun for me is that we've got a great panel that's kind of touches on all of the interesting races. There's some statewide races, but we've got some experts that'll be talking about. There's a ballot measure or two, city council races, and some really new faces that are coming into their own in terms of changing of the guard of the leadership in Oregon. So even though we don't have a nationally prominent race, perhaps with the exception of the homeless issue, which is the homeless services issue, which is a very audacious and bold plan if it were to pass, there are a whole bunch of things that I think will be fun watching this evening, and also a lot of suspense.
One of the most important races, and one that's going to be really fun to watch that people in Multnomah County have been keyed in on, is the district attorney's race. We've only had two men who've been district attorneys in Multnomah County in nearly 40 years, and our Maggie Vespa is covering that race for us tonight, among others. Maggie joins us now from her home. Maggie, tell us what you'll be watching.
Hey, Laural. Yeah, first election night live from my kitchen in my career, so this is really interesting. But you really hit the nail on the head. This DA's race in Multnomah County is the first of a few that I'm kind of focusing in on tonight. And as you said, this will be the third time that the position is actually vacated, and we get a brand new district attorney as a result of that in nearly 40 years. The current DA, Rod Underhill, is stepping down after 2 4-year terms. His predecessor held the job for 30 plus years. So this is really big. And we have two newcomers vying for the job right now, Mike Schmidt and Ethan Knight. So Schmidt right now is running a state agency that kind of comes up with new criminal justice policies. Knight is a current assistant U.S. attorney for Portland. Schmidt's kind of been dubbed the true reform candidate. And he has said that he wants to use data to kind of see how local groups are, how effective they are at helping the addicted and mentally ill. Ethan Knight also kind of making that a forefront of the changes that he wants to make. He's not quite as sort of reform focused as his competitor is, as Schmidt is, but he is endorsed by some of the more establishment forces like the current DA and the Portland Police Association. Up next, we've also been focusing a lot on the Metro Homeless Services Tax. Now, this would be a $250 million a year tax on high earners and businesses that bring in more than $5 million in revenue per year, and the $250 million would be spent on things like addiction and mental health services, employment support, and rent assistance. The campaigns behind it say they need this now more than ever. They needed it pre-pandemic, absolutely, because the unsheltered rate on the streets of Multnomah County is at its highest ever. But now they say they need it even more because the pandemic is putting people out of work and putting those on the fringe of homelessness in an even more vulnerable position. Groups that oppose it say this is not the time to tax businesses, and businesses will in turn pass those costs on to the consumer. So a big battle there. Then we're zeroing in on 2 congressional seats. The 5th District House seat is really interesting. Representative Kurt Schrader facing a big challenger, perhaps the biggest in his nearly 12-year career, and that's Milwaukee Mayor Mark Gamba. Schrader has described himself as socially progressive and fiscally conservative, so he's kind of walked that line for a long time. Gamba is a big Bernie supporter, if that gives you any idea, and he's being backed by the brand new Congress, which is the same group that helped newcomers like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York get to their congressional seats. So they've made some waves already nationally. The district itself is interesting. It kind of runs south of Portland down into Marion County through Salem and then over to the coast. So it's a really diverse district. And Gamba was quoted by OPB as saying that he wanted to see if kind of the progressive politics that have taken root in Portland have really kind of made their way out to the suburbs. So that's something to watch. And then finally, the 2nd District House seat is being vacated by Oregon's only Republican member of Congress, Representative Greg Walden, 22 years. At the end of his 22-year career, he is now retiring, basically, and leaving that vacancy. And Politico flagged this as a way to kind of measure concern in the GOP as to whether they can really retake the House. This seat is a big kind of bellwether for them. So total, we have 11 challengers, 7 on the GOP side, 4 on the Democratic side. We're zeroing in on 4 main GOP challengers tonight. Former state representative and former gubernatorial candidate Newt Buehler, current state senator Cliff Bentz, entrepreneur, business owner Jason Atkinson, and then commodities trader Jimmy Crumpacker, all sort of kind of flexing their conservative strong points at this point, Second Amendment rights, anti-abortion stances. Newt Buehler, to that end, kind of had some more centrist statements that he made when he was making the gubernatorial run, and those are kind of coming back to bite him. Oregon Right to Life declined to endorse him, instead endorsing Crumpacker, and so that was kind of has been a big fight in this race. So that one we're watching as well. Whoever wins that, again, will have a Democratic challenger in November. So those are the 4 that I'm kind of zeroing in on tonight. We'll have updates online and on social media throughout the evening, and obviously we'll be checking in back with you from my kitchen.
Yeah.
Laural, back to you.
You know, Maggie, it's Dan, actually. I'm getting ready to send things over to
Dan.
Pat.
Hey, Dan.
Hey, what's up? Before we leave you in your kitchen, I was just wondering, you're used to covering these things at campaign rallies and, you know, talking to people during these big events that they're having on a night like tonight. How are you covering it tonight from your apartment?
You know what? Zoom is our best friend, Dagnabbit. It has been so strange to get to know these candidates and get to know their staff, and especially the staff, because you're not really putting faces to the names. You know, we're used to reaching out, and as a candidate kind of grows in their prominence, we get to know the staff members that are sort of controlling their campaign and controlling the access. And right now it's been just pretty much names attached to emails. And then we meet the candidate for the first time on Zoom 3 minutes before, if we're lucky, we start interviewing them. And so it's been really interesting. It's also been really interesting to kind of see the tone that they choose on social media. A lot of these campaigns are kind of flexing their social media muscles, their hashtag muscles for the first time. And some feel like they're equipped to do that, some don't. And you kind of see them sort of learning in real time, which is a learning curve that you don't see when they're in person, kind of with their traditional swagger doing their thing. So it's something that has been really interesting for us to watch as well. All the candidates that we've come into contact with, I will say, have done their best to meet us on the social realm and try to, you know, obviously get their stance out there. It serves them, but they've been cooperative with us as well. So fascinating stuff for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Maggie, thank you so much. Now we go from Maggie's kitchen to Pat Doris's, I don't know, his office or something maybe. There he is. So Pat, you're focusing a lot on some of these city races, and we are looking at what could potentially be extreme turnover. I mean, the only seat not up for grabs is held by a person who's only held it for, what, 2 years at this point, in Joanne Hardesty. So we could see the kind of turnover in the city commission that we've never seen before. Tell us about some of the things that you're going to be watching out for tonight as they unfold.
Right. Well, it's going to be very interesting, Dan. There's 5 positions, including the mayor, and 4 of the 5 are up for election tonight. Ted Wheeler has a very strong campaign going. His most prominent challenger is Sarah Iannarone, and we'll see how she does tonight. It's possible some folks think that Wheeler is so strong that he might win 50% plus 1, which will give him the mayorship again. He's trying to be the first 2-term mayor since 2005. That's when Vera Katz left office after 3 terms in office. So just a reminder, these are nonpartisan positions. And in this primary, the top 2 winners go on to a general election then in November. But if you win by 50% plus 1 vote, then you don't have to do the November election. You have the seat outright. So we'll be watching for the mayor's race. Also in position 2, that's Nick Fish's position. He was a much beloved city commissioner who died from stomach cancer back in January. A number of people are vying to take his spot. In position number 4, that's interesting because it's Chloe Eudaly, who is a first-time city commissioner. She kind of ran on a housing platform, and a lot of folks say that she has delivered on a number of that points. But she is being challenged by several people, including Portland's former mayor, Sam Adams. Adams has an interesting political background. Some might say checkered, but he is definitely a significant challenge and not to be looked past. They may end up with one of those contested races that will go on in November. So those are some of the biggest ones. Amanda Fritz also, let me not miss that one. Amanda Fritz is not running for re-election, so hers is position number 1. It's believed that Carmen Rubio should win that pretty easily. She's the executive director for the Latino Network and has been really networked very well, very strongly throughout the city, is very highly regarded and thought well of. And so she may be one of those people who win this by 50% plus 1 tonight. We'll be watching. Back to you, Dan.
Pat Doris, thank you so much.
You bet.
Laurel, are you taking it from here? I think somebody was going to send it over to Rebecca Tweed.
Yes. I was just saying that we have 54 candidates altogether running for Portland City Council. I think the last record was 41 candidates in 2004, so a lot to watch, and we appreciate Pat Doris watching that for us. We want to bring our Republican strategist in now, Rebecca Tweed. She was the campaign manager for Newt Buehler when he ran for governor against Kate Brown in 2018, and she's also consulting with 4 candidates during this election, not races that we're covering tonight, but you're an insider, you're a strategist. How have you coached your candidates and how to handle a pandemic? This can't be in your playbook, how to do a campaign in a pandemic. You must be learning as you go here.
Yeah, certainly. And thank you very much for having me this evening. It has definitely been a very different environment, appropriately so, and taking into account what we need to care about for Oregonians and citizens. But when you're running a candidate campaign, your 2 jobs are to raise money and meet people. And those become very difficult when you're not able to do either of those in person. So it's been very different. And the timing of when the stay-at-home measures went into place and some of the other adjustments we made were exactly when campaigns would start doing all of those activities. So quite a shift, actually.
Rebecca, I'm going to stop just for a second. I have another question for you, but I want to let folks know that polls are closed. We're coming up on 5 after 8, and we should be getting some results for you any minute, and we'll bring them to you. But I did want to ask Rebecca, while we wait for those results, is because you have some particular knowledge of Newt Buehler. You were the campaign manager. He's in that really tough race in the 2nd district. He has sort of had to moderate his positions because he was running as a moderate Republican against Kate Brown, a pro-choice candidate. He distanced himself from Donald Trump, and now he's had to moderate those a little bit. Tell us what's been going on in that race for Newt Buehler.
Sure. Well, I'm not involved in that campaign this time around, but I think that Newt, has represented a large portion of that community as a state representative and as a business owner. I think he's recognizing that in order for him to connect with voters in Eastern Oregon and in that district, and where they align. Those are some of the positions that he needs to be more forward with, that he's held over time, but you have to adjust your narrative a little bit based on who you're speaking with. But he's been part of that community for a while. I think voters in Congressional District 2 have one of the most unique opportunities to vote for who will represent a seat that's been held for 22 years, and very different values than other parts of the state. And that's what all of those candidates are connecting with right now.
Do you have any thoughts about the inside track? Who might have the inside track on that Republican nomination tonight?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Newt Buehler has the highest name recognition as somebody who's run statewide twice and been a state representative. Certainly, Senator Cliff Bentz has represented that community for a long time. I think it will be one of the closest races to watch this evening, and probably will not be results that we see early. I think we'll see some late ballots coming in that may adjust where that. Certainly, a newcomer like Mr. Crumpacker shakes up that campaign a little bit. We've seen that with some of the endorsements that have come through. But I think it'll be a very tight race. I don't think anybody will get the 50+1, even though it's not needed in that seat. I just think it'll be very close tonight.
Rebecca Tweed, thank you. Our Republican analyst will check back with you. Hey, we just got some big results. City Council position number 1, that's Amanda Fritz's position, that she's not running for re-election. The Oregonian has just called Carmen Rubio to win that seat, making history. The first Latinx city commissioner has won tonight. So congratulations to Carmen Rubio. We'll try to have her on later on. She's going to be my guest on Straight Talk on Thursday. So that's very exciting. Let's go to Dan, because I know you're going to be talking with Nikenge Harmon Johnson.
Yeah, that's right. I'm excited to see her Straight Talk on Thursday. That's going to be fun to talk to her after this historic win. Now, as far as Nikenge Harmon Johnson is concerned, she's with the Urban League of Portland, and I'd really like to get your take on the unique nature of campaigning during this coronavirus, because I think it kind of leveled the playing field in a way, because people who had a lot of experience canvassing this town and talking to the people in this community suddenly had to find a new way to do so. What was your take on just the way this all played out leading up to tonight?
I think you're right when you say it leveled the playing field in some ways, because no one has experience campaigning in this kind of environment. When you can't knock on doors, when you can't shake hands, when you can't kiss babies, what do you do as a candidate to try to get elected? And I think that's one of the things that's exciting about this time, is that we're seeing candidates adapt. We're seeing campaigns adapt very quickly. So that's people and also issue campaigns. Have found new ways to connect with voters, and I think some of those new connections, some of those new pathways, are actually going to stick, because people are finding that they're effective, and they'll last long after this pandemic is a thing of the past.
I think all of us can relate to that in our everyday lives, right? The things that we've had to adopt now are going to become things that we realized, oh, these actually make life a little easier, or we can connect with each other a little bit differently. But is there also that sense that maybe during a time when there could have been so much turnover, where there is so much change that could happen, specifically when you look at the city commission and the mayor's race, where maybe people didn't have an opportunity to get to know the names that they didn't know as well as they would have if this pandemic wasn't such a big impact in our life?
Sure. I mean, it's certainly true that, incumbents always have an advantage. I think that they were probably able to extend their advantage during this time of pandemic because their names are already known. Folks who are in office are able to talk to their constituents and to do the work needed during a public health emergency, to look like a strong leader, to be engaged with their constituents. So that helps them to stay in front. But if you're a challenger, or for that matter, if you're going after an open seat and there are so many candidates like there are with these city council races, but races also in other parts of the state, then what do you do to get your name out there? And I think that's where you've seen the video conference house parties and video conference fundraisers. I've been participating in a couple of those. You see that text banking and phone banking is extremely important. And certainly good old-fashioned mailers. Folks have definitely been filling up my mailbox, and probably yours too, with those flyers, because that's a chance for voters to be able to see them even when they can't show up at the door.
And Kenge, I know that you were interested in a number of races. This is Len, and around that are below perhaps the Secretary of State or state legislative races, county commission races. Others you were thinking perhaps of running yourself at one point in this cycle. Are there any campaigns that you particularly want to call our attention to early in the evening that will go back to you as the evening goes on?
Sure. This is one of my favorite times of the year. Election day is sort of a holiday for me. I always wait until this day to return my ballot, just because I enjoy the actual feel of a real election day. And I'm watching a bunch of different races, including Washington County Commission. We're set to see potentially more history being made after Carmen Rubio's apparent victory tonight. But in Washington County, we're looking at Nafisa Faye would be the first Black woman and the first refugee to serve on the Washington County Commission. I'm very excited about her race. I'm also paying attention to some races in the Mid-Valley. For example, in House District 19, Salem City Councilwoman Jackie Leung, she's running in the primary there, along with a couple of other candidates. That could be a contentious primary, but an even more contentious general election battle to try to flip a seat that's been held by Republicans for quite some time to a Democrat. Jackie is a Salem City Councilwoman who won an upstart campaign last year. She knows how to connect with constituents. She's a young working mom, and I'm excited to see what her campaign does. And there are a number of others that we might touch on as the night goes further. But I think the young candidates, the women candidates, and certainly the candidates that are running this cycle are very exciting to me.
That's right. That's exactly what we're looking for, and we'll be paying attention to as the evening goes on. Laural, I'm wondering if we want to take a look at some of those numbers that we've just gotten in.
You know what? I have them here, Len, and I want to say now, the new numbers coming in the district attorney's race, the Oregonian now calling that race for candidate Mike Schmidt, who is the reform candidate, runs Oregon Criminal Justice Commission, and has defeated, according to the Oregonians calling right now, Ethan Knight in the district attorney's race. Len, do you want to weigh in at all about your interpretation of those numbers, what it means?
I think Maggie had it pretty well, Dan, at the beginning in terms of it positioned itself as a reformer, Schmidt, against a more traditional prosecutor. At least that's the way that played itself out. I think Schmidt will have a very positive impact. Remember, the Multnomah DA is probably somebody who affects policy from a more left and center perspective anyway. And so Schmidt will become immediately a big voice in not only local jurisprudence and criminal justice issues, but also statewide criminal justice policy. So it'd be interesting, and it's a beginning of a very big career, I think, for Mike Schmidt.
We heard so much, Len, about this. We heard this word reform. In fact, both candidates were using the word reform, and Maggie Vespa, who was touching on it earlier, did some coverage on the story at 6 o'clock, talking about how that's been this national trend for district attorneys to run with reform when it comes to criminal justice. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it means as far as Mike Schmidt and reform and what people should expect to see from him?
Well, it's often the choice of which cases to prosecute. It's also the case of how to use statistics in order to inform the way in which criminal justice is operated in the community. On a number of things, he's already campaigned and said he was not going to take on certain cases. And I think we'll see a slight shift. I don't think our normal viewers will see a dramatic impact. But over time, I think Schmidt's emphasis on really statistics and looking for the facts to guide judicial policy will have a big impact both locally and statewide.
Talk a little bit about Carmen Rubio winning outright tonight, avoiding a runoff, a big deal because there were 7 candidates in her race. She had gotten just about, I think, all the endorsements. So if anybody was going to win outright tonight, I think a lot of people thought she would. She worked in the office of Multnomah County Commissioner Serena Cruz. She worked in the office of former Mayor Tom Potter. She worked early on for the late Commissioner Nick Fish, whom she has called a mentor. She's the executive director of the Latino Network. How do you see Carmen Rubio fitting in with this city council, Len?
Well, she's going to be someone I think everybody's going to be learning a lot more about, knowing about, and looking to as a leader, even in a first term. She's got all the skills that you just talked about. We saw them on display when she came in, when she was on the panel talking about the kind of a eulogy for Nick Fish. She obviously has the ability to be a bridge builder, and yet she also reaches out into the communities that Nkenge was talking about in terms of new communities of color and others who feel like like they maybe have been left out of the discussion at City Hall. She's going to be a very big force, I think, very quickly. I think people will be hearing a lot about her. I'm looking forward to seeing if she comes on Straight Talk also, because she's the more you get to know her, the more you like her.
You know, some candidates that are elected to city council have struggled if their first time in political office to really ramp up. I talked to her campaign, Carmen Rubio's campaign, and they think that she has already built relationships through the Latino network of 10 years and working for all these city office holders that I mentioned, already built those relationships that she thinks she'll be able to hit the ground running. What's your take?
I think so. We'll get a chance to talk to, somebody like Steve Novick and talk a little bit about the difference of coming from the outside and going the inside. And we've got Chloe Udelio, who's really kind of a referendum on how well she's been able to make that change. And now we've got Carmen Rubio, who's able to kind of step in. I think when you look at the City Hall, it's a game of threes, as they say. If the mayor gets reelected, he's going to have to look around for a couple of people to help with a progressive but a stabilizing kind of agenda, particularly coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of work that's got to be done, and you need somebody like a Carmen Rubio, if you're the mayor, to help you get a lot of things done, regardless of what bureau she actually takes hold of. So it's impressive victory. She has a momentum going in. She'll have the chance now, between now and really November, December, to really kind of get up to speed, and everyone will look at her as the person kind of coming into the office. And so she's got a lot of things going for her, and I think she will, as you say, Laurel, hit the ground running.
And let me just mention Candace Avalos. She's an educator, the acting chair of a Citizens Review Committee, and is committed to improving police accountability. And in its endorsement of Rubio, the Oregonian said she really is a person to watch. And now we're looking at position 2. This is the special election for Nick Fish's seat, for fulfilling it for the next 2 years until 2022. And so Loretta Smith, at this point, early on, is ahead with 19%. Len, you want to weigh in on this? I know you expected a couple of these people to be in on a runoff.
Yeah, remember the runoff, if it occurs, would come August 11th. It's a special election to fill out seats here. So what we've got is Loretta Smith with a high degree of name familiarity, having been a county commissioner, and a lot of momentum and early fundraising advantage. Sam Chase, who is a sitting Metro commissioner, and then Tara Hurst and Dan Ryan, and then it's a very full race. So it's no surprise that if this comes out to be a runoff, it wouldn't be a surprise. I'm not sure that we've seen the end point of this yet. I mean, this is going to be one of those suspenseful nights where we're going to see whether or not the people with the most name familiarity are the ones who come out, emerge as the victors, or whether it's the people who have kind of put together a better campaign, if you will, to catch up with those folks. Tara, hers, for example, has gotten a lot of endorsements by environmental groups and women's groups, abortion rights groups, and others. So she really is probably the one who's gained the most progressive ground. And Dan Ryan is well known in all of the education circles. So it's really a group of people who've all got their own strengths. And I don't think we've seen the end point of this race yet.
You know, one thing, Len, this is Dan here, that I found very interesting is how many candidates seem to flood to this specific seat that was vacated by Nick Fish. And I think a lot of people need to understand that this is just a 2-year term. So the winner of that race, and by all means, it looks like it may end up going from this primary to a runoff. So they're going to have to run for the primary, run for the runoff, and then spend 2 years in office before running again. Why do you think that so many people flooded to that seat as opposed to some of the other either vacated or open seats on council?
Well, it's always tough to go run against an incumbent, even in an unprecedented year. So a seat that opens up, either Amanda Fritz's seat or Nick's seat, unfortunately, that became open, becomes an attractive place for a newcomer or someone who wants to be on the city council. And of course, as we said, Carmen Rubio came in and seemed to kind of clear the field a lot. So the Amanda Fritz seat didn't look so attractive. It even forced somebody like Sam Adams to go against an incumbent rather than go against into an open seat. So I think this seat drew a lot of people because it looked like a somewhat clearer path onto the council.
All right, we want to take a look at the mayor's race right now. Well, Ted Wheeler hoping to avoid a runoff. He needs 50% plus one. Right now, looking at these numbers, he's got it with 52%. Sarah Iannarone, really considered, I think, the strongest competitor in this race with Ted Wheeler, 22%. So we'll see if the Oregonian calls this later on. But right now, Ted Wheeler out by 52%. What have you been hearing from some of the people you talked to, the insiders, Len? They think that Wheeler might win tonight outright?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And talking to a bunch of insiders, people who've worked in City Hall or been involved in political campaigns, there are a bunch of races that they were uncertain about. This was one of those, depending on who you talk to. Some people thought that because Ted Wheeler had managed to play through the pandemic as well as you possibly could, used incumbency as an advantage as opposed to a disadvantage, we talked about that earlier, he wound up looking like he was in charge, focused, and decisive. Some things that weren't always attributed to him in the rest of his first term. So the pandemic, plus the fact that there wasn't a very vigorous presidential primary campaign to bring out a left-oriented part of the Democratic constituency, or the city of Portland constituency, in this race, were played out to his advantage. So he did a good job with the cards that were handed to him, and the way the campaign was set up, it was really kind of against. The cards were a little stacked against a challenger or an insurgent who needed some momentum, traction on the doorstep. If this was an on-the-doorstep campaign, it might have been a different outcome.
Len, let's take a look at some numbers now of one of the other really high-profile races for Portland City Commission, and this is Commission Seat 4, and this is a tight race right now. You see Chloe Eudaly with 30%. Mingus Mapps with 29% and Sam Adams with 28%. Now this is, every expert I talked to had a different interpretation of what might happen tonight, but I think everybody assumed it was going to be close. I know that Mingus Mapps had a lot of grassroots kind of support. That name seemed to come out of nowhere, and you started seeing it on lawns everywhere, and it appears that he's getting the votes to go with it, Len.
Oh yeah, this is a great race, and the numbers that come out of the blocks show that it is. I also talked to a number of people who said they had different pairings as to who was actually going to be in a runoff. Everybody thought it was going to be a runoff, but they all had their own, including Keith Wilson, who wound up getting one of the endorsements of one of the papers, and I think acquitted himself quite well, given all the fact that he didn't have very much of a high profile. I'll really be interested in Steve Novick's take on this, because this is obviously the seat that he lost to Chloe. And yet he stayed very involved in public affairs, and I know that he'll have a sense of how difficult it is for someone to, in the case of Chloe Eudaly, to be an outsider, have a strong insurgent position, and then come inside City Hall and try and then be really the incumbent, and then be the referendum on the incumbent. So I think this is going to be one we're going to watch right down to the wire, and I think one of those three people will be in a runoff with one of the other ones. So it'll be we'll see how that
Hey, Len,
plays.
I just want to mention to folks at home who really, and I know you're really paying attention to this Metro Measure 26210, the homeless services tax, and right now it is way out ahead. People voting yes for this tax, 59% to 41%. It would provide $250 million across the Tri-County area for homeless services. We'll be watching that carefully, but right now it has a healthy lead. I want to bring Nkenge Harmon Johnson back in. Nkenge, what is your take on the city council races so far, especially the victory, the really overwhelming victory of Carmen Rubio?
Yeah, I want to say congratulations to Carmen. Felicidades. It's really exciting that a fellow social justice warrior, someone who runs an amazing organization, Latino Network, will be joining the city council in Portland, apparently. She's going to do great work. I have all faith. I also think that suddenly some of the issues that she's been working very hard on, in the community and the community-based organization are going to be a lot easier to move on at the city council level, which is terribly exciting. She decided to do a difficult thing, which is to continue to run an important and growing organization at the same time. She built a campaign and connected people to her vision. I think that's outstanding. I'd also like to talk about the Eudaly race. I mean, look at those numbers. I don't know that people were expecting Mingus Maps to do as well as he's done thus far, but it's been interesting for me to pay attention to his campaign and to watch him grow. I've probably had more, personally, I've had more touches from his supporters than from any other candidate for that seat. And of course, I know folks in Commissioner Daley's office. I know some people who are supporters of Sam Adams. But in terms of just the consistency and the repetition and the folks saying, hey, pay attention to our campaign, I've heard a lot from Mingus Maps supporters. So I'm not surprised to see that he's doing so well this evening, but I bet there plenty of people are.
What do you look for from the City Council in Kenge as we move through this pandemic for the city to change and hopefully come out of it even better?
Oh my goodness! I'm glad to hear you ask that question, because if our goal was to go back to things as they had been, then we're aiming far too low. Our city, county, and for that matter, the state has an opportunity to make some really big changes so that our communities can work for everyone, and not to continue to see this gap that we've been seeing growing between the haves and the have-nots, the housed and the unhoused, the well-educated and the uneducated. We have a chance to really make some different choices. And I think in the past, Portland has made a lot of investments in big business. It's made a lot of investments in making the city workable for corporations. And now it has a chance to sort of get back to its roots as a livable city, try to reach back to a place where families and working class folks could call Portland home. I think that with more people on council, like Carmen Rubio, like Commissioner Hardesty, who understand what Portlanders need and want to call the city home, I think it's going to make a world of difference, and it's really exciting.
Kenge, thank you so much. Let's take a look at the numbers for U.S. 2nd District right now in Oregon. This is the seat formerly held by the only Republican in Oregon, Republican Greg Walden, who retired after a decade, and the numbers coming in now are very tight. We got Cliff Bentz out ahead with 32%, Jason Atkinson with 25%, Newt Bueller with 18%, and Jimmy Crumpacker with 17% right now. We want to bring back in Rebecca Tweed, a GOP political strategist, worked with Newt Bueller in the past. What's your initial take on the numbers that we're seeing right now out of that race?
Sure. I'm actually not surprised that Cliff Bentz is in the lead. That spread is actually larger than I would have expected, but it reflects what we've seen in some polling recently, that Cliff would be ahead. Cliff really did a grassroots campaign unlike any of the other campaigns did, especially utilizing the new tools that have to be available to us during COVID-19. It seemed like every time I turned around, there was another virtual town hall, a large social media following, some significant endorsements. And that carries a lot of weight in Eastern Oregon, differently than large money in campaigns sometimes. So I think we need to continue to watch it. It's certainly still a close race between folks as we wait for votes to come in. But it does reflect what some recent polling showed, that Senator Bentz would be in the lead right now.
Has polling adjusted at all due to this pandemic? Is that done any differently? When you say grassroots, you kind of described a little bit of it there with the virtual town halls. I watched a couple of them from various candidates. They certainly aren't as effective as what you see when you're in person or when you see it over the typical airwaves. What do you think certain candidates like him were doing differently, specifically, than some other people to kind of really make people feel like they were talking to them?
That's a great question. Actually, in that environment in Eastern Oregon, the ability to reach as many voters over that much geographic space is nearly impossible to replicate in person as what you can do in Zoom meetings. You would not be able to get folks from all different counties to come to one location without a stay-at-home measure when they are 6 to 7 hours away from each other. But the opportunity to engage from home really is a different environment in Eastern Oregon and in those rural communities, and gives them an opportunity to say, look, our counties are struggling. Somebody's reaching out. It's an hour of our time. I would also say that the reason that some of these tools that Nikenge mentioned and that we've talked about are effective is because we have a more engaged audience at home. Typically, when you're doing voter outreach, like a door-to-door or phone bank in your direct mail schedule, you're basing it around people being out of the home, at work or with family or other distractions. Right now, everybody's at home, everybody's engaged, there's a much higher influence there. And so to your question about polling, one of the scientific needs in polling is to be able to reach the right people, the right sample, and the right folks to represent whatever area you're polling. And that's very difficult to do when you can't reach some folks at home during the day. The ability to now do polling because folks are home and because they are picking up the phone makes that much quicker. It makes the turnaround of that information much more quickly available, and campaigns can respond more quickly. At least that's what we've seen in the adjustments we've made in the last 2 months.
Rebecca, there was a fair amount of money coming into that race, into the Republican race from special interest groups around the country. Do you have any comment about that? Why it attracted over $1 million from a variety of different candidates? And what's the difficulty if you're a campaign manager when independent campaigns come in and kind of take over your campaign message a little bit?
Well, I think the heightened attention to the seat is that it's the only Republican seat that Oregon has right now. And so if you are in national Congress or you're a national organization, with the way that Oregon is set up politically, if you don't retain that Republican seat and that hold on that, especially with redistricting coming, you could lose it, and you could lose it for a very long time. So the interest in holding that longer than the 22 years that Congressman Walden has been there and moving forward is going to catch national interest. I would say if you are a campaign manager in that seat or somebody that's calling some of the shots and there's money coming in from outside, it needs to still match the narrative that you're trying to provide on your candidate, right? And the message that you're trying to share. And the whole purpose of an independent expenditure campaign or outside dollars like this is that you don't have that connection. It's difficult to make sure that things match the pace, that they match the narrative that you want, that you're understanding the voters inside of Oregon, which frankly, I think you need to be from Oregon to understand Oregon voters. So it can be a challenge to balance that and to make sure you follow all the rules, of course. But these candidates, all of them have run a very good campaign, very focused on the voters in Eastern Oregon and what their interests are. It's a very diverse district, even though it is a large portion of Eastern and rural Oregon. There are big differences between what happens in Ontario and what happens in Klamath Falls. And the ability for a candidate to diversify themselves and then have donors and interests that can reflect that same messaging and same narrative is extremely important.
Thanks, Rebecca. Dan and Laural, can we go back to that homeless services measure? I do believe that's, if there's one takeaway that the national folks are going to take, and when they look at Oregon, they're going to see whether or not this measure passed or not. It's an audacious opportunity to kind of deal with the number one problem on everybody's list of priorities, and we'll take a look at how we're doing here on this race.
And the Oregonian has called it. This has passed.
Okay.
You see 59%. This is a tax that will tax their income, individuals' income over $125,000 and households with income over $200,000 and businesses with profits over $5 million in the Tri-County area of Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington counties, and pay for $250 million of homeless services. The Portland Business Alliance was behind this. Even Trailblazer great Bill Walton promoted it with a yes vote, although a number of chambers of commerce were against it, like Gresham, Beaverton, Tualatin. They felt like now is not the time for a tax. But the president of Metro said this is absolutely the right time because this recession, this great recession, maybe even rivaling the Great Depression, is going to throw more people in need. And it sounds like a lot of voters, the majority of voters agreed with that and voted, even with the pandemic as a background, they voted for that tax, so that passed. I do think we have somebody on the telephone to talk to us. The winner of the Multnomah County District Attorney's race, Mike Schmidt, joins us, the social justice, criminal justice reform candidate. This was a tough race with Ethan Knight. You pulled it out with 76% of the vote, Mr. Schmidt. How are you feeling right now? And I'm not sure he's there. Is he still there? We're still waiting.
He's happy. He's not talking.
Bear with us. It sounds like we might have lost him, so we'll get back to that. But just to pick up again on that homeless services measure, you were really saying, Len, that this is something the rest of the country may take notice of.
Yeah, we're going to look at Oregon and say, okay, in the middle of a pandemic, when everybody is concerned about costs and financial anxiety and what have you, this is a campaign that figured out how to take the number one issue on all of our polls dealing with this issue, playing off of the housing bond measure that Metro put on last time. And in effect, the campaign, a wide group of a coalition of groups, grassroots groups and others, really almost forced this issue onto the primary. This was one that Metro was not sure whether it wanted to have on the primary or the general, and the campaign group said, no, let's put this front and forward right in the primary, and let's fight it out. Then the campaign came to us and showed us their poll, and I think they talked to Dan and you, Laural, and showed that they were polling at about 57, 58% when they heard all of the no arguments. And so what this was a campaign that really understood how to take its here together message to the public, right for the times, and also run a kind of a gangbusters campaign in terms of the groups and the way in which they got into the vote that they needed to get. So I think people around the country are going to look and say, wow, Portland and the Tri-County area, metropolitan area, is very serious about addressing the homeless questions. They have taken their enormous wealth in our metropolitan area and applied it aggressively to the most blatant problem that we've got to solve in our community right now. So I think Oregon's going to look quite good in the national light, and it also, I think, local voters should feel really good about voting yes for this kind of measure.
A couple of other measures that I was just watching here, the Portland measure to renew the gas tax that voters passed a few years ago has now been renewed. 10 cent a gallon gas tax, bringing in $75 million, I think, a year over a couple of years. That has passed. Also, the Beaverton measure that would change the city form of government has passed. They said, yes, we want to change the way our city form of government is and have a city manager and not just a mayor. So that's going to be interesting to watch how that changes. But now I want to bring in Steve Novick, our good friend Steve Novick, who used to be on Left Hook, Right Jab with us when we did the debates with Lars Larson, former city commissioner. Steve, great to have you with us. You were watching the results, and you're especially interested in that position for Chloe Eudaly, the incumbent. That was your position. She beat you in the last election, and I find it fascinating that you have endorsed her. Tell us about that.
Well, before that, I want to focus on a couple of things that I think need to get some attention. One is that the big winner tonight is actually Amanda Fritz, because most of the people running for city council used public financing, which was Amanda Fritz's baby. She and Charlie and I passed it in December of 2016. And the candidates who took public financing had to agree not to take big checks, but anybody who gave $50, that was converted through public financing to $350. So it's a big win for Amanda. It's a big win for democracy. I'm delighted to see how well public financing worked. Also, you've talked a bit about Carmen Rubio, but I think people need to understand how extraordinary it was what she did. Carmen Rubio did not start off as a well-known person. She'd never run for office before, but she was so well respected among Portland political insiders that nobody who was regarded as a high-profile, serious candidate ran against her, and she ran outright. That, to me, is just amazing and a tribute to the reputation that she's built over the years in Portland. Another thing that I think is remarkable is that the homeless services tax, which is a tax on rich people, passed without strong opposition, as you noted, from the business community. And normally the business community is violently against progressive income taxes. But in this case, I think they saw that homelessness is the #1 issue in people's minds. Progressive income tax is the easiest thing to pass, so they went along with it. My hat's off to them. So, are you still with me?
I'm still with you, Steve. All very interesting.
Okay. So the Chloe Sam Mingus race, I'm actually not surprised it was that close. I know there's still a lot of sort of free-floating anti-City Hall sentiment. So the mayor isn't he's not at 30%, but the mayor is fighting to stay over 50 himself. Sam Adams obviously is well known. But also, it did not surprise me that there were a bunch of people who didn't want either choice, and they're going with Mingus Maps, who, by the way, has a great name, Mingus Maps. You just can't beat it. And it'll be really interesting to see who makes the runoff. I mean, normally you expect more liberal voters to vote later. They tend to be the people in inner Portland who deliver their ballots on the last day. But I'm not sure who would be perceived as the liberal in that race. One thing I should note is that I've been surprised in the last 2 cycles that you didn't see more candidates like Chloe. I mean, Chloe won, I think, partly because she had this iconic Portland job. She was a small bookstore owner. So I've been surprised that you haven't seen more people with iconic Portland jobs running, like yoga instructors or acupuncturists or gardening coaches. And I think that people with jobs like that are missing a trick by not running for office and taking advantage of their Portlandia cred.
So you win as an outsider, and then you have to come in and you have to govern as an insider. Can you talk a little bit about how difficult that may or may be, and then that Chloe kind of took on some groups, including neighborhood associations, in her term in office, and how you think that may have changed the dynamic of this race?
I don't really know. I mean, Chloe did not have the greatest relationship with the media, and that still matters, as I learned to my own cost a few years ago. And yes, the neighborhood association issue got some attention. I mean, most people don't belong to neighborhood associations, so I don't know if that's an issue that really resonates with a large number of voters. But the way it was portrayed as she messed up, so that obviously affects her. But also, again, I think that there's a lot of people who just see that the city is still struggling with high housing prices and homelessness and are not satisfied with the incumbents. I think that Ted Wheeler, frankly, will be very lucky if he gets over 50%, because if he gets less than 50%, I think he's in trouble. Because I think most of the votes against an incumbent are anti-incumbent votes, and if you don't win in May, there's a good chance that you will lose in November. So if Ted Wheeler comes in at 49% today, I think that if somebody would give you odds, you would be smart to bet some money on Sarah Iannarone. So I think that Chloe, I mean, she had some of her own issues, but I think simply being an incumbent in this environment is tough.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. I know Dan's going to jump in here and talk to Mike Schmidt. We think we have him back on the phone. Dan?
Is my mic up? Yeah. Hey, hi, guys. Yeah, this is the winner of the Multnomah County District Attorney's race, Mike Schmidt, on the phone with us now. Sir, thank you so much. Congratulations. We appreciate you spending some time and talking to our viewers. What's the reaction tonight?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Well, you know, feeling very grateful, a little overwhelmed at the massive outshowing and outpouring. So feeling great.
So, Mike, it says right here in my notes, it was supposed to be a tight race, but the numbers don't look so tight to me. Tell me about how the evening went. Are you surprised with the number of votes that separated you and Ethan Knight?
You know, I'm not really surprised. You never know how these things are going to go, for sure. So, you know, you don't know. But, you know, just from the outpouring of support from all kinds of, you know, community organizations, labor organizations, you know, people, attorneys. I mean, a huge coalition that this campaign built of people who wanted to see major reform in the criminal justice system. So, you know, it's gratifying. You never really know until the votes are counted, but in some ways I'm really not that surprised.
So you ran on reform, and that's what people voted for. They voted for this reform and the reform you would bring. Talk to us about the challenges now, because of course reform needs change, and to make changes can be difficult.
There's no doubt about that. Change is always challenging. You know, but I think no matter who would win this race, we were both facing, you know, the need to make change. In this new COVID-19 environment, resources we know are going to be stressed to the max. We're going to be asked to do even more with less. And this district attorney's office is already thinly staffed. So in that challenge, of course, will come opportunity. And, you know, I think that there is going to be a real conversation that we can have about what kind of reforms can we do to, first of all, make sure that public safety is first and foremost, that's what we are there to do. But then how can we accomplish that in a changing environment, in a reform environment, and looking at some of the biggest issues facing our criminal justice system.
Now that the pressure of the election is off, I've just been dying to talk to candidates, to people about what it has been like to run during all of this. I'm sure you made the decision to run for district attorney well before we had ever heard of coronavirus. But here we are, and a majority of this campaign that you ran was behind a mask. So how did you get your word out? How were you able to spread your message? And what do you think worked, and what do you think didn't work during this lesson that we all are learning right now?
Yeah, you know, it completely changed the game. You know, I've been essentially campaigning and working on running for this office for well over a year at this point. And so it did completely change everything for us. I think things that worked, we have had a lot of Zoom meetings, but I think where I got the best reception was when I could have one-on-one conversations with other people. Like, for example, I had a one-on-one conversation over Zoom with Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, and then people could watch that and ask us questions and participate. So I think that worked. I think what didn't work was trying to move the traditional fundraising model of, doing a house party, going to someone's house, and you put out the crackers and you talk to folks in person. You get to make that in-person connection. That did not work so well moving to a Zoom setting where you didn't really get to, shake hands and people get to really get a feel for you. It definitely, the fundraising environment was extremely challenging. So some things worked really well, and we wouldn't have done that, in this pre-environment. But then some things, we're going to have to keep, other candidates are going to have to keep figuring out.
Well, you found a way to resonate and your message to resonate with a lot of voters. Mike Schmidt winning the race for Multnomah County District Attorney with 76% of the vote tonight. Again, congratulations and thank you for spending some time with us, Mike.
Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
And now we are excited to have joining us the newest member of the Portland City Council, the Commissioner-elect Carmen Rubio, who won an overwhelming victory in position number 1, the seat now held by Amanda Fritz, who did not seek re-election. Carmen Rubio, congratulations. How are you feeling tonight about this victory?
I'm feeling great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are so excited to have you here. When you take over in January, what are some of your priorities? Share with us what you're hoping to bring to the council.
Well, the number one priority for me is making sure that we get through this pandemic intact as a city and as a community, and making sure that we navigate it well, we plan for our future. Then, first and foremost after that is tackling our housing shortage and also our homelessness crisis as well.
Carmen, you joined me on Straight Talk when we did a tribute to Nick Fish, and you talked about how he was your mentor and that he inspired you to run for this office. He encouraged you to run. Of course, that was before the pandemic, before he got really ill in December. And I know you imagined that maybe you would have a victory party with him there. How are you feeling tonight about Nick Fish?
It's a bittersweet time for me because he was really the one that very much encouraged me to run, as you said. But I've been holding him in my heart and my thoughts, and it just makes me motivated to, conduct myself in a collaborative way that he set the example for so many of us, and hopefully actions that would make him proud.
I'm sure he's looking down on you tonight and is proud. Steve Novick said a little bit earlier about how really the big winner tonight is Amanda Fritz, the person who currently holds the seat that you just won because of the public financing campaign that that program she started, and I think you took advantage of it. Is there anything you want to say about that?
This was such an incredible opportunity to, open up the field to many very qualified candidates that would otherwise not have an opportunity to run, like myself. So I am very much supportive of this program, and I look forward to seeing more candidates join future races. I think that'll have a tremendous impact in how we shape the future of the city going forward.
So, Carmen, this is Len. Congratulations again on your really unprecedented victory in this unprecedented year. As you look at the city council, your colleagues, have any comments about the council that you're about to go on and what kinds of things, what portfolio you'd like to do, what kinds of things you want to work with the mayor on?
Yes, I've had the opportunity to meet and talk with all of the commissioners and the mayor prior, to tonight about issues that we care about. And I'm very, very much looking forward to working with them. I find that we're very aligned around issues of housing and homelessness and also making sure that our economy gets back on track. So I feel like there's a lot of energy and opportunity to work together in this new council. I'm very, very excited, and just looking forward to the opportunity to connect as soon as we can.
Carmen, you're the executive director of the Latino Network. What happens to the Latino Network when you leave?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, and thankfully I have a stellar leadership team, and they're very committed to making sure that we continue the work. And as you all know, in this pandemic, our community has been disproportionately hit pretty hard. And so it makes it all the more important that we make sure that we have leadership and a structure in place to keep a lot of the emergency and crisis response services that we have now in place. So part of my transition is also going to be preparing for the transition of my own position. And so we've begun some of that early planning work, and it was dependent upon the outcome of tonight that, we'll step up our timeline a little sooner.
Well, I look forward to having you on Straight Talk. I know we're going to be talking later this week, so thank you for that. And congratulations once again on being the newest member of the Portland City Council.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll turn it over to Dan. He has some more numbers for us. Dan.
Yeah, that's right, guys. Let's take a look now at the District 5 race. It is being called at this point for Kurt Schrader. Of course, he was running against Milwaukee Mayor Mark Gamba. You see the numbers there. Kurt Schrader winning with 70% of the vote over Gamba. And then I've been paying attention to the Facebook feed. We have this on Facebook Live right now. A lot of people are commenting. I am reading those. And Mary wanted to know about the Secretary of State's race. So let's take a look at those numbers right now. Primarily the Democratic primary. You see the candidates here with Mark Haas with 38% of the vote right now. Shemia Fagan with 35% and Jamie McLeod Skinner with 27%. This is tight. I think that we assumed this was going to be a tight race. I want Len to weigh in on this for just a moment. What do you think about these numbers at this point in the evening, Len?
Well, they reflect the tightness of the race and the way that people looked at it. It's really a significant race. The job's important, and it also is substantively. It deals with all of the elections issues and a variety of other kinds of auditing issues. Important role in number two person in line in terms of the running the government. But it also is kind of a breeding ground for governors. A lot of our historically great governors have been secretaries of state. So it's an important race for a number of reasons. This is a race in which Shemia Fagan has kind of come into the race with both pluses and minuses, meaning the people who supported her or pushed her into the race, particularly the public employee unions, have really financed the race and pushed the race. And a lot of people thought that having that support would be the determining factor in the race. She came into the race after Jen Williamson dropped out of the race. Mark Haas is a state legislator who's done a lot of really very progressive legislative tricks in the legislature. He's done really important public policy issues, and so people have looked at him as someone who was kind of a can-do type of guy, and I think that's the campaign that he ran, and it seems to have resonated. He made the most of early money that he was able to get, even though I think Shemia had a lot of money come in at the end and probably tightened up the race. I'm sure we're going to watch this one tighten up quite a bit as the evening goes on, but this looks like about the way it's going to be with Mark and Shemia in the lead. Jamie obviously is really a blue chip candidate, ran a great race in the 2nd Congressional District, probably would have been a winner in the 2nd Congressional District, but she felt that the Secretary of State's race was more important, a place where she could make more of a positive impact. So she ran a great race, but these two who are in the lead right now, I think will be the ones who are in the lead spots, and one of them will squeak through, not by a lot, but by a little when all the votes are in.
We should mention on the Republican side of things, no surprise here, Kim Thatcher has won the race here, and that's something that was predicted long ago, winning with 86% of the vote in those predictions, appearing to come true tonight.
Dan, do you have any of the state legislative races? Because as long as we're in a state race, obviously the Secretary of State's very important, but also looking at some of the really interesting contests that have been at the House districts or Senate districts. Do we have any of those numbers at all? Yeah, we got so the booth is working on those right now. Our producer's working to pull those up, and we'll get those to you, Len. What is your take moving into the general election for Secretary of State as we look at kind of who's more likely to square off here? Well, Kim Thatcher is, an impressive person. She's a good candidate. She's been an effective legislator. But the Democrats want to win that, take that seat back, and so they're, I think, in a presidential year where you could expect that a Democratic vote will turn out and a progressive vote will come out, the Democrat will have the advantage. I'd really be interested in Rebecca Tweed's kind of analysis of this from a Republican, the challenge they've got to kind of keep a seat that they finally won statewide. But I think the nod would have to be to one of those two Democrats. There will be some concern, again, if the public employee unions overplay their hand. If they were to win this race, and also they've kind of pushed around some of the other Democrats in races. We can talk about that a little bit later. They've played their card pretty heavily, particularly because of issues relating to PERS and legislation last session. They've had a history of really kind of penalizing Democrats who go against, shave back any public employee retirement benefits or in any way, shape, or form. They did this with Greg McPherson a while back when he ran for Attorney General. But this particular race, they penalized Mark Haas on this races, and it's yet to be seen whether they become the winners or the losers in all these races. But on your question, I think the Democrat would have to be considered the odds-on favorite in a general election, unless Rebecca or somebody else in our panel has got a different take on this race.
Let's see if we can bring Rebecca in. Let me ask our producer, do we have Rebecca right there? She is. Let's talk a little bit about that Secretary of State's race. It's so important. Next in line to the governors we saw when John Kitzhaber resigned and Kate Brown ascended to be governor. Dennis Richardson, the late Dennis Richardson, a Republican, held that office until he died last fall, and then Governor Brown appointed Bev Clarno, so that position she said she would not run again. So now she would not run for that office. So this is an open seat. The Democrat, whoever wins that between Haas and Fagan and also Jamie McLeod Skinner, will take on State Senator Kim Thatcher from Kaiser. How do you see that race shaping up? What advice would you give the Republican candidate if you were running that campaign to try to take that office back?
Well, I think this is a really important campaign to talk about right now, so I'm glad we're discussing it. You know, what I think is different about this Secretary of State race compared to many is that Senator Haas and Senator Fagan and Senator Thatcher have all been colleagues for a very long time. And we don't usually see that type of profile where you have partners in the legislature that are now running against each other for a statewide seat. I think that'll be something to watch as far as what the messaging looks like going into the general election. Len's correct. A Republican statewide will have a steep challenge to climb, especially in a presidential year, especially in a state that consistently votes statewide for Democrat positions and Democrat representatives. But I do think Senator Thatcher has quite a record to run on, and that's what she will focus on and she will need to focus on. I think right now, you know, in the midst of the pandemic and what will come out of that, Oregonians are looking for stability. They're looking for somebody that they can trust. And I think that the best candidate and the candidate that will be the most successful will be the one that can convince voters that there's one part of the equation at a state level that is supposed to be nonpartisan, that is supposed to be the most objective in decision making, and that's the Secretary of State. And the candidate that can convince voters to trust them and that they're reliable will be the one they can go forward with. So when you look at what you've done as a legislator, that's really what you can go towards. And the fact that they've all had a record and they've all had something to point to will make it very interesting, I think, to watch where they head for their direction in convincing voters they're the best choice.
And how challenging is that going to be to try to make that case amidst this pandemic and the sort of campaigning we've been talking about that just changes everything? And do you see any outside money coming in to try to support a campaign like that?
I think there will be outside money. I know that this campaign has been watched by national interests and national folks for much longer before candidates had even filed for it. When it became clear that Secretary of State Clarno would not run for this position again. And it is a very important position. It's midterm to the governor, and she will not, of course, be running again. So this seat will carry through the next term, all things considered. I do think that voters in a pandemic situation or any situation, you know, you typically, if you were trying to take out an incumbent or take out a role of somebody like a Democrat that's in a that's running for a race like this, you have to point to a problem that's created by that party and then come with a solution for it. We don't really have that situation here. We have a Republican that's trying to run after a Republican has held the seat. You have to let folks know that you're the better choice without running a negative campaign. I don't think Oregonians are interested in that. I don't think they're in the mood for a person-to-person negative campaign. And so the development of the pandemic and how the state responds will play a big influence in how these candidates are able to reach voters in November.
I know we want to move on. I just want to kind of keep on this for just a second. The race is important also, as you know, Rebecca, because of the job that the Secretary of State's got for redistricting, for auditing, for a number of things that have to do, election security, cybersecurity, and whatever. It seems to me that those are going to be kind of very important races. The last race seemed to be a vote not for someone so much as against someone. So this will be interesting to see how the candidates really kind of position themselves, as you say, as the best person to kind of do the job that we've been voting for.
Absolutely. I think that's a very key point. When Secretary of State Richardson, former Secretary of State, was running, the national narrative and where politics was really a person versus person battle. We saw that at a presidential level. We've seen that in campaigns that have come after the 2016 campaign cycle. Right now, I think voters are looking for solutions. And I think you can see that reflected in the homelessness tax that passed in Portland that you were discussing. The city council and the mayoral races of folks that have a proven record of doing something, even if they haven't been an incumbent. Oregonians are looking for stability right now, and they're looking for something that they're familiar with. And even though the two Secretary of State candidates, whoever emerges out of this, may not be well known in completely statewide fashion, that's difficult even in a primary and made more difficult by the challenges of campaigning, they will have to communicate with voters that this is really a job of checks and balances. It is a job of paperwork. It is a job where Oregonians are coming for a solution and looking for something that is tangible. And that's really what the Secretary of State does. They provide tangible solutions. They provide tangible outcomes to issues that people have. That's what the focus will have to be, and it'll be very different. I do think the candidates will have to pull themselves away from that person-to-person narrative that we expect going into a presidential year, that we expect going into some very serious House and Senate races that I think will be much more partisan. These candidates have a challenge, but I actually think it'll be one of the more exciting campaigns that we've seen, regardless of who wins on the Democrat side this evening. I think it'll be one of the most interesting campaigns we've had for a while in Oregon.
Rebecca, thank you. Yeah, Dan Haggerty talking here again. I wanted to just say I think maybe one of the biggest headlines out of all of the headlines tomorrow is going to be this vote supporting the homeless services tax. If we want to pop that up again, voters in Portland approving this 1% tax, and I think it's something we should talk to Maggie Vespa about. I know Maggie's been covering this in a lot of detail and just sat through a news conference from the people who supported this measure. I assume that they're over the moon. I don't think that there was any guarantee that this was going to pass, but it appears that voters in Portland want this to happen. What was the reaction tonight from those supporters?
So Dan, they started it off, and by the way, this was a Zoom news conference that they planned prior to tonight in the hopes that they would win. It was a planned sort of victory conference with fingers crossed, they noted. But basically tonight they said, we're really excited, but we're not surprised. They were worried, as everybody is, because these times are so unpredictable and they had no idea how voters would react. And maybe people are more scared, less likely to endorse a new tax because of the pandemic, and therefore maybe they're in more trouble than they thought. But deep down they said they always felt like Portland would come through in their minds and indeed endorse this tax, which we now know that they have. So to kind of review, $250 million a year coming into Metro starting next year is when that revenue will start flowing in. And that's from a 1% tax on basically high earners and then businesses that bring in more than $5 million in revenue a year. They had a huge fundraising week in this last week leading up to the election. The campaign behind the measure did. And they said basically they felt like that was the surge coming through at the end because they had started to see some opposition advertising. And that kind of caused them to ramp up their efforts because they felt like the opposition might have more of a footing, again, because of the pandemic and because everybody is so scared. They did tell us, or they did confirm, I should say, that they did get multiple donations from Oregon Governor Kate Brown in the last few weeks. As far as when services could change, both to, for those wondering who need access to housing or need help keeping their housing, and then both for everybody wondering who just sees the impacts of our housing crisis on our streets, we were told it's kind of iffy. In normal times, basically, they said counties would have no problem ramping up services now, knowing that the money is coming in later and then just paying it back later. Right now, as we know, local governments have their budgets gutted because of the pandemic. They don't have the revenue coming in from, say, kind of tourism taxes and others, and business taxes. And so they don't have the money to front these services like they normally would. That said, that doesn't mean that some services won't wrap up. They have a whole system in place as to figure out where exactly this money is going to be spent, how much is going to go where between the 3 counties and between different kinds of services. Primarily, they pointed out a lot more rental assistance will probably be needed because of the pandemic than maybe would have been needed during normal times. So perhaps the allocation has changed a little bit, and those perspectives have changed a little bit. But yeah, just to kind of reiterate their message off the top, they said this was really exciting. They weren't surprised, but they were relieved, and they really feel like Portland area voters came through for them. Guys, I'm going to toss it back to you.
Yeah, Maggie, I mean, few people that we work with, nobody that we work with here at KGW works as closely with the topic of homelessness as you do. And you, I think most people who live in this city observe homelessness, but you're one of the people who knows the people in this community, the people trying to help the folks in this community. What are you hearing from them as they anticipated this vote, and what are you thinking they're feeling now, knowing that the funding that I think a lot of them were hoping for is going to in fact be there?
So the head of Join, that's interesting that you asked that. The head of Join, which is a group that helps basically connect those who need housing to the myriad of services that could help them get to it, because there's going to be a lot of red tape. It can be very confusing. She came on the call and she said, you have no idea how hard it's been for our staff to look families in the eye as recently as this week and tell them, and these are families who say we need help now or we will lose our housing this week or this month, and tell them, I'm so sorry, we don't have anything for you. And she said it is the most horrific feeling. And she said, and to know, number one, that a lot more families and a lot more people might be finding themselves in that scenario, particularly for the very first time. And they point out people who maybe have always done well enough to be able to afford housing, it's really jarring when for the first time they need help finding it. They have no idea how to navigate the system. And so a lot of people might be finding themselves in that scenario now because of the situation that we're in. And so she said, especially, knowing what we've been through and given the current crisis that we're all experiencing, this is just such a huge relief to know that we will have to look fewer families in the eye and tell them, I'm sorry, we can't help you. And so she was holding her toddler in this Zoom news conference, and she, was just really speaking from the heart. And you could tell this was personal for people who work in housing and in advocacy for those who are houseless. It is absolutely personal, and she was just over the moon. It was really sweet.
Maggie, thank you. And, Len, a question for you, and I just want your take on this. To me, it was a real statement that was made tonight. I'm not the only person feeling that way. I know you touched on that earlier, but look at us in the middle of this pandemic. What are the things that we keep talking about? We keep talking about how businesses are hurt. We've done a bunch of stories on gas prices, how our gas prices continue to be high despite some prices hitting under $1 in other states, and people wondering, are we taxing gas too much? Yet here we see this in the middle of all of it. We are approving money for homeless people that taxes businesses, okay? And we've approved, or at least re-upped, on our gas tax, that 10 cents gas tax that was there. What is your take? Are you surprised that both of these measures passed, considering that they were both proposed way before we knew what coronavirus was? And what do you think it means about, as we move forward with the tone that was set here?
Well, it's easy to flip and say that Portland areas, the Tri-County areas, never found a tax that they don't like. We do have a history of passing things and being supportive around public services. But I think more importantly, area voters like to vote for things that make sense and seem to attack problems that they think are really there. Maggie captured the emotion of it, the human nature of it, but there's also a logic to it. Metro passed a housing bond last time, where the Portland area voters, metropolitan voters passed it last time, which Metro put forward. They have now both a parks issue that they're going to be spending, and they're looking forward now to a kind of a transportation issue. There's a series of issues that Metro has suddenly become really one of the forefront governments to be able to handle an aggressive, offensive type of agenda, as opposed to just taking those issues on that the region wanted to dump on them. So to answer your question specifically, I think this is a tremendous vote of optimism for the Portland metropolitan areas. Granted, the measure was carved out so that it would tax mostly the rich, mostly the big businesses that are making money, and so 90 some odd percent of households weren't going to be affected, 90% of businesses weren't going to be affected. But it shows that if people think through a problem and set up a reasonable answer, for voters in this Portland metropolitan area will vote yes on this. So a vote yes on solving problems, a vote yes on kind of giving Metro significant kudos and a role for the future, and then a vote yes for this grassroots coalition, which last election cycle put on a green energy jobs measure and really rocketed, I think, Portland politics. And this coalition this time was put together and really rocketed in a positive way the regional politics. So there's a lot here to really like about this. And that's why I think when you started off this questioning, it's the one measure that I think people on the national level looking at the Portland metropolitan area and Oregon are going to say, wow, look at that. That's a very optimistic note in a kind of an unprecedented, kind of era of this pandemic.
Jump in here, sure. And we're going to take a look at the 2nd Congressional District, the Republican primary. There were 11 people running in this, really 4 front runners. And as you see, Cliff Bentz has been declared the winner in this 2nd district race to replace Greg Walden, who's retiring after 22 years in Congress, a really powerful figure, big shoes to fill. Cliff Bentz has been both a state representative and state senator. He has experience as a farmer and rancher, small business owner. He was born in Salem and raised on a ranch in eastern Oregon, went to Lewis and Clark Law School. I want to ask Rebecca Tweed, our Republican strategist, how big of a deal this is to you, and does this mean that Cliff Bentz is going to be the next congressman? I mean, what chance does the Democrat have in this race?
Well, first, I want to say congratulations to Cliff Bentz, the seat. That's quite a win in a hard-fought campaign. I would say to answer the latter part of your question, this will remain a Republican seat. I do think over time, whoever's the congressman, Congressman Bentz to be, we'll have to look at how voters are shifting and changing. There are different attitudes. Certainly, as we see redistricting come about, that district will change after the census and redistricting is done. But I think it's reflective of a community that has known Cliff Bentz for time, that is familiar with voting for him for a very long time. And I think it'll remain a Republican seat come November. And I expect a lot of big things. There's been a lot happening in those counties that he'll be representing. Certainly, they are the counties that have led the way to the reopening plan with Governor Brown. And I know that Cliff Bentz has been involved in that. All of those candidates have been working very hard for that. And I think they've all done a great job running a campaign with very similar platforms and voters that support them. But congratulations to Cliff Bentz on that win tonight.
Rebecca, how much clout does Oregon lose with Greg Walden not running for re-election? He really had the ear of the president many times. He was very powerful in the House. Talk a little bit about Greg Walden and what he meant to Oregon.
Sure. Well, Greg Walden, Congressman Walden, has been a staple in Oregon. He's represented his communities very closely for a very long time and has done that very well. As you mentioned, he's had close relationships with all of our leaders at different levels at a national level. I think it'll be a big gap. He's held leadership positions and really changed some things for the state of Oregon. Particularly in this coronavirus pandemic, he's been in touch with leaders and with regular voters on a regular time and has built long relationships over 22 years. I believe that Oregon holds a special place and that Republican seat holds a special place nationally. And soon to be Congressman Cliff Bentz will be welcomed with open arms and a lot of work to do. I don't suspect that we'll see Congressman Walden go away. He's been very influential because he cares about the state. He'll continue to do that in different roles. But I do think, after 22 years, there's some time to make up, and there's work to do to hold that type of position. But I believe Congressman-elect Bentz will be able to do that.
How about Newt Buehler? He was trying to make a comeback here. He ran for Secretary of State in 2012 against Kate Brown, lost in that race. Then you were his campaign manager in the gubernatorial campaign in 2018. He lost to Kate Brown again, and now in this race came up short. Are we going to hear from him again in politics, or what are your thoughts?
I hope so. I think Newt Buehler's done a great job representing his community and a lot of values that Oregonians share. He has a real heart for good policy and a heart for making sure that we have solutions. And I think he will continue to try to be involved in efforts that move Oregon forward. And there are supporters, there are people that agree with his ideas and support him throughout the state, and they should. I hope all of the candidates that have, whether it's in CD2 or the city council races or anything in this state, we've had the largest ballot, the most candidates that have ever run for anything. I think that's really exciting. Even candidates I wouldn't vote for or candidates that I work with that may not come out on top, I think it's really positive that people are moving forward. So I do think that we will continue to see Newt involved in politics. I hope that Jason Atkinson gets involved again. I think it's a forward movement for Oregon to have so many people that are interested in representing us.
Rebecca Tweed, thank you. We're going to go back to my colleague Dan, and we're really watching this mayor's race with Mayor Wheeler and Sarah Iannarone. A little bit of confusion about that race. Dan, fill us in.
Interesting confusion here, Laurel. So there are 19 people running for mayor. When we first looked at the numbers, Mayor Wheeler had 52% of the vote. Now, in this primary, if you get 50% plus one, you don't have to go to a runoff. You win. So Mayor Wheeler would continue to be mayor, and kind of looked as though that's the way things were going to go. The four major candidates are the people who are in 1, 2, 3, 4th place, and that's Mayor Ted Wheeler, Sarah Iannarone, Teresa Rayford, and Ozzie Gonzalez. But because there are so many candidates, and somebody pulling in 500 votes here and somebody pulling in 700 votes here, a couple of other candidates like Bruce Broussard pulling in like 7,700 votes. You start to add all of those up, and they're beginning to take away from Mayor Wheeler's lead, including, at this point, write-in candidates, which have made up about 622 votes, according to the Secretary of State's website, which means that if Mayor Wheeler doesn't have 50% plus one of the vote, we're looking at a runoff with the second place contender, which at this point is Sarah Iannarone, which really makes things interesting. I wanted to send it over to Len because of something that Steve Novick said earlier, and that's that it is in the best interest of the mayor, of course, more than just the obvious, to win in this primary, because the way he put it was every vote that Mayor Wheeler wasn't getting, regardless of who else it goes to, could be perceived as a vote against him. And when you consolidate those in a general election, he could be in some real trouble.
Yeah, well, Steve's a provocative and thoughtful guy. I just think he's dead wrong. Here, this is going to be a race. If it does get into a general election, I think it will still be in the same circumstances. I don't see how Sarah gets the traction she needs to really overtake the mayor in this. And I think he's demonstrated, in fact, if the issue becomes the kinds of things that Rebecca was talking about or others, who do you trust? Who's got the experience to lead in tough times? I think the mayor can make a good case. Now, runoff elections are jump balls, and so that she's got to hope that she gets into that situation. That the mathematics that you just discussed helped her, but I'm not sure that I agree with Steve's analysis, and it may in fact be an analysis that's been good in the past, but that the pandemic and election 2020 throws all those old rules out the book.
Let's bring in Nikenge Harmon-Johnson, our political strategist from the left. Nikenge, do you want to weigh in on the mayor's race and the results we're seeing so far?
Sure. I mean, I think it's interesting the way that we're seeing results trickle in the mayoral race in Portland. I don't know. It's an exciting race. I think it's also very difficult to tell who's going to prevail. Certainly, Wheeler has an advantage as the incumbent. He ran a campaign. There are times when some incumbents get lazy, but I think that Ted Wheeler's been very busy on the campaign side, even as he governs during the pandemic. But I also have to say that Sarah and her supporters, they've been running and engaging, and they've been out there not only trying to reach out to voters who always vote in primaries, but also trying to turn out new voters, trying to turn out folks who are often ignored during primaries because they don't have a strong record of voting in the past. So I think that there could be some surprises in this race, but I have to agree with Len when he says that there are so many candidates in the field, and certainly the four strongest, Ozzy and Teresa, Ted and Sarah, are the ones that we've heard the most about and are likely to garner the most votes. But because there are so many candidates out there, it's going to be very difficult to win outright tonight. Wheeler's still in the lead, so it's possible, but I think it would be a bit of a surprise for me to see if he were able to pull it off tonight.
Nikenge, I know you support social justice reform, and we haven't weighed in with you for a little while. What is your take on the big victory of Mike Schmidt, the social justice reformer in the DA's race?
Yeah, for anybody who's following me on Twitter tonight, I've already been celebrating and cheering it on. I don't, make endorsements in races in Portland because I run the Urban League of Portland, and I don't want people to be confused about Nikenge Harmon's views, which are what I'm offering tonight, and confused versus what the Urban League might be standing for as a nonprofit organization. But I, as a member of the Oregon State Bar, as a progressive attorney, as the wife of a trial lawyer who also does some defense work in the criminal justice system, I am thrilled that Mike Schmidt has won tonight on many different levels. I think for social justice, it makes a huge difference. I've been paying attention to this race because I care about it. I think the Multnomah County DA has a leadership position amongst DAs in our state. Certainly, the Oregon District Attorneys Association, has a lot to do with the way that policy is made and built in our state legislature. Often elected officials defer to DAs and to that association. And they are very frequently on the opposite side of social justice leaders like myself when it comes to making fair and equitable decisions about criminal justice reform, about public safety, about investments in the state. And I think with Mike at the helm in Multnomah County, we have a chance to see something very different. Beyond that, I will say that there are prosecutors all over the state, and certainly in Multnomah County, that would like to be about their business differently. They would like to not try children as adults. They would like not to hammer people with Measure 11 charges when it's a close call. They would like to make different decisions that are about justice, but they sit in offices under leaders who demand the hardest sort of sentencing and charges when maybe that's not really the best choice for public safety or for justice. I think that some of those assistant district attorneys who have the opportunity to work under Mike Schmidt are going to have a chance to step up and say, hey, I showed up to be a DA to help keep my community safer. I didn't show up here to make things less just. I didn't sign up for this job to make things harder on workaday Portlanders and Multnomah County residents. So they will look to Mike for his leadership to be able to craft a different kind of prosecutorial office. I'm excited about that because I know those DAs exist. I know that they had to be quiet because in their role, they can't be very politically active, but they're going to be very excited about his leadership. And I think it portends it portends a lot of positivity for the city of Portland and for the county. I also think that we have a chance to see some different influences on the Portland Police Department and on other local law enforcement agencies who bring their cases to the district attorney of Multnomah County to be prosecuted. The DA has a lot to say about the way that police handle their business, a lot to say about the way that they treat citizens and those who are suspected of crimes. So all around, I think it's a great day for those who believe in justice in Multnomah County. And it's a great day for John Legend. I don't know if you saw that, Laural, but yesterday, John Legend tweeted about Mike Schmidt and named him the candidate to beat in this race. And that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, that probably didn't hurt tonight either. Thank you, Nikenge. Dan has some more numbers for us.
Yeah, let's go back to City Commission. Let's take a look at Seat 2 and Seat 4. Seat 2, the one being left vacant by the late Commissioner Nick Fish. Seat 4, the one being held by incumbent Chloe Udaly. Will we get new numbers on that one right now, guys? Here we see this is for Seat 2, Position 2, Loretta Smith with 19% of the vote, Dan Ryan with 17%, Tara Hurst with 14%. So this has been staying pretty true from when we looked at the numbers, at least the percentages, when we first looked at them at least a half an hour ago. And as we take a look now at Position 4, another very tightly contested race, and you have Chloe Eudaly out ahead with 30%, Mingus Mapps at 29%, and Sam Adams at 28%. I want to bring in former Commissioner Steve Novick, and Steve, you can pick which one you want to start with here when it comes to the discussion. I find the seat 4 race to be compelling. I wanted to know what your take is at this point in the evening to see it so tightly contested. It's almost kind of like a race. Hey, just don't come in third place.
Yeah, and I think I might be repeating myself, but usually you can predict who's going to win a close race in Portland by going with the idea that the more liberal candidate will pick up votes as the evening goes on, because the more liberal voters tend to vote later. But I don't know who would be perceived as the liberal in this race, so I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know how the matchups would play out depending on who the top 2 are. I don't know if Mingus Mapps has the edge against Sam Adams but not against Chloe, or if Chloe has the edge against Mingus but not against Sam. It's going to be really interesting to see not just what happens tonight, but what happens in the general.
You know,
by the way, one thing that
I was just going to say, you know, that race between those 3, because you had Mingus, who was kind of coming out of nowhere and making waves, and the other 2 candidates had name recognition. That was the one I really expected to see a lot of fireworks and a lot of headlines and a lot of coverage and debates and things like that as we went through this campaign, but we just didn't see it as strongly as we would have typically because of coronavirus. How do you think that weighed in to what we're seeing tonight, and do you think it had a big impact?
I don't know. I think that campaign people tend to overestimate the significance of campaigns to begin with. And in the coronavirus era, obviously, people aren't paying that much attention to campaigns. I don't know actually, to tell the truth, if I had to guess, I might guess that if people were paying more attention to campaigns, you might have seen more of a firefight between Sam Adams and Chloe Eudaly, with them hammering on each other, and that might have meant the Mingus Mapps did even better, because often in a 3-party race, if 2 candidates are fighting and the other is not, the one that is not picks up votes. So I think it may well be actually that Mingus Mapps suffered from there not being as much attention to this campaign, because you didn't see that kind of Chloe-Sam firefight. By the way, as long as I'm on, I need to give a big shout out to the women and men of the Portland Bureau of Transportation, because the gas tax, as you've noted, passed overwhelmingly, the renewal of the gas tax. And 4 years ago, a bunch of us worked like dogs to get that passed, and it passed with 52%. But in the past 4 years, the people of PBOT have worked hard to deliver the paving projects and the safety projects that we promised. People have seen the results, and they endorsed those results heartily tonight. So hats off to them.
Absolutely. Steve Novick, thank you so
much.
much.
And by the way, before I go off, I have to say that Mike Schmidt's victory is not only a huge victory for progressives and part of a progressive wave of people voting for progressive district attorneys across the country, it's also a big victory for old baseball fans who remember Mike Schmidt of the Philadelphia Phillies, his 10 gold gloves and 548 home runs.
That's hilarious. I was thinking the same thing. When are you going to run again, man? You seem like you seem like you're itching to get back in the game.
I've always been an intent observer, and I'm happy being an intent observer.
Thank you so much. Hey, let's send things back into Laural.
We're so glad you joined us, Steve. We're going to be wrapping up things here in a minute, so we're going to weigh in on the Secretary of State's race, kind of go around and get a final take from everyone. In the Secretary of State's race is the Democratic primary. There are 3 candidates. Mark Hass, the state senator of 20 years. He really was a signature author on things like the Student Success Act, a free community college, the Oregon Promise, all-day kindergarten. He has 38%. Shemia Fagan right behind. She's backed by the large public employee union. She's a state senator, also served in the House. And Jamie McLeod Skinner, who really played up her rural roots. She lives in Central Oregon in Terrebonne. She ran against Greg Walden in the 2nd district. She gave him one of the best races, I guess the best race he's ever had since 1998, even though she lost by 17 points, being a Democrat in that race. So close. Mark Hass out in front right now. The winner of this race, not been declared yet, will run against the Republican primary winner, State Senator Kim Thatcher of Kaiser. So let's get some final thoughts from Rebecca Tweed before we wrap things up on how you think things went tonight and your takeaway, Rebecca.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me on tonight. You know, I'm actually not surprised with the results that have come out. I think the it very clear where they stand on issues like, or candidates like soon-to-be District Attorney Mike Schmidt, Carmen Rubio winning. I think we're just seeing a very clear message from candidates where they're headed and where Oregon's headed this fall with some of these decisions they've made this evening. I do think that it's great. We've had many more competitive campaigns heading into this cycle. I think that the impacts of coronavirus and what that does on campaigns has been really helpful. It's kind of taken campaigns down to a very basic level. You need to have real conversations with real people and meet voters where they're at instead of having them come to you. And I think we're going to continue to see that going into November. So I'm not quite surprised. I'm pleased with some of the results. I think Portland voters have made some good decisions this evening on who they've elected for those roles, and we'll see some significant movement forward there. I think voters made it very clear where they stand in Congressional District 2, even though they had a good set of candidates that were running there as well. So I'm really excited for November. I'm excited to see what will come about. But tonight's results, I think, show that all of Oregon, but specifically Portland, are continuing to focus on their community and how to move their community forward. And those will be the types of results we see in November as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. Dan?
Let's turn now to Nikenge Harmon Johnson, talking about your take of tonight. Any surprises? What are you taking away from this evening?
So I think there are a number of surprises this evening, and I've been following races on my mobile device here. One of the things that I've been watching is the money that's been pouring into races. And I know we mentioned that a little bit earlier. We talked about Secretary of State's race and just the dollars that have been going in to back various candidates. But on the local level, I've also been quite surprised. For example, I live in Salem. That's home for me. And the Salem City Council races, more than $100,000 has been pumped into those races for seats that are unpaid, right? Those are volunteer sort of roles. And suddenly we've had the big interest and big dollars flooding into the local races. I'm curious about what that means. I'm also paying attention to Washington County. I know that Washington County closed down some of the ballot drop-off sites. I understand they say it's because of the pandemic and just the need to sort of use their people power differently. So it'll be interesting to see whether that has an effect on voter participation tonight. I also really am excited that our state has done it again. I think that our turnout numbers have actually been good. I'm looking forward to see what the turnout looks like tomorrow. We have many more voters this time around than we did last primary because of motor voter and other things. So while the percentages may not look that hot, I think just the raw numbers are going to be quite strong, and that's exciting because our fellow Oregonians have showed up and are showing out to demonstrate to the rest of the country what it looks like when you vote by mail. It's been a smooth process. We're getting results in. It's not even that late. It can be done. So to our sisters and brothers in other states who are watching, and Secretary of State's offices and governor's offices and legislatures that are thinking about whether vote by mail works for them, it works for us again and again and again. And I hope that they will take the Oregon example and follow suit this year and every year thereafter, even after this pandemic is gone. Those are some of the things that I'm going to take away this evening, and I'm looking forward to continuing to follow certain races. If I can lift up one more thing, I hope people will pay attention to the number of persons of color who are winning primaries tonight. I mentioned Jackie Leong in Salem. Phil Chang is winning his primary in Deschutes County for a county commission race there. We have a couple of other candidates for House seats who are Asian American, and they're winning. I think it's a very strong night for people of color across the state, and I'm really excited about that too.
Well, thank you for your insights, Nikenge, and for joining us. We really appreciate your insights and analysis tonight. And I'll be seeing you on later this week, perhaps on Straight Talk. And Len joins us now. And Len, I know you and I have covered, I think, political races, election nights for 20 years together. This has to be the most unusual election night that we've ever been a part of. But I know that you've talked about how this may be generational change. We're really seeing younger people of color, as Nikenge was talking about, stepping up. What are your final thoughts about tonight?
Well, first of all, it was a great panel. I think we got some really good insights. I hope our viewers got a chance to enjoy that. Extraordinary primary, 168 days till the general election. It'll be a presidential election. It means twice the size of the electorate. So all of the things that we saw in a primary won't come through in a general. It'll be a different kind of a election, but a lot of things are positive. You got to say that the the homeless measure has got to be the shining light of optimism for Oregon to kind of send out to the rest of the world. Really a great victory. You have to say that 54 women running and being put into recruiting and being supported by Emerge has changed the dynamic of Oregon politics, much the same as Nenge was talking about. People of color, women and people of color have changed the dimension of Oregon politics and a direction. Some people have been running in state races. Lisa Reynolds on the western suburbs looks like she's winning that race. LaCanne Pham looks like she's winning on the east side of Portland. And you can see that all around in state races. People are kind of moving up. It's a changing of the guard. And we'll see at the top level, we see some same of faces, but we also see some interesting new faces. And so I think there's a lot to take away from this race that's very optimistic, and given the fact that we've in the middle of this horrible pandemic disease.
Thank you, Len. There are still a lot of races not decided that we've been watching. The mayor's race in Portland, also the Secretary of State's race, very close. City council positions 2 and 4, that's Nick Fish's seat, the special election there, and also Chloe Udaly, the incumbent there, with Mingus Mapps and Sam Adams very close. So we're watching those, and Dan, it's been really fascinating, but we're going to have more coming up at 11, and also you can check the results throughout the evening on KGW.com and the KGW mobile app.
Thanks so much to everybody for joining us tonight for this kind of special edition, this streaming service. I'm going to echo what Len said. Thank you to our entire panel. They did a fantastic job, I think, wrapping everything up for everybody at home as we continue to watch these races, see how things pan out, and we'll give you the latest tonight at 11 o'clock.